Good evening. My name is Sue Murphy, and as the president of the Robert H. Jackson, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. Thank you for coming, and thank you for being interested in this very important topic. The Jackson Center is pleased to be part of the Green Up Jamestown movement, working with our many partners in the area to raise awareness and educate people on environmental issues facing our local community and the broader world around us. And it is my extreme pleasure to introduce to you Julia Craighill, who has had the inspiration for this program and has been working tirelessly to put together an informative and thought-provoking program for all of us. Julia owns Insight Consulting in Silver Springs, Maryland, where she is a sustainability expert who helps companies that want to develop green programs but are struggling to get them launched or need a plan to ensure that they will withstand changes in the future. Using experiences from her 30-plus year career within the architectural, construction, green building, and sustainability industries, Julia can identify the specific systems that need to be implemented by an organization to transform its mission and values into actionable business practices that link people, planet, and profit. She received her BA in architecture from Washington University in St. Louis and her MA from Syracuse University. Julia is a member of our Jackson Center Board of Directors, and she is the granddaughter of Robert H. Jackson. Please welcome Julia Craighill.
Hello, everyone. Okay, so now we have some technology. There we are. Okay, so I am going to kick this off because we've got some great speakers. I'm going to try to move through this quickly with a Robert H. Jackson case, actually. Known as the Forbes dairy case here in Jamestown. And I'm going to just briefly go through what this case is. It was an early case. He was 30 years old when he tried it. And as you'll see as I go through, it has a lot to do with today's topic. So here's a really quick timeline of this case. 1895, the city of Jamestown extended their sewer out to a creek, Cassadaga Creek, and had it deposit raw sewage right before where the Forbes dairy was. And of course, the dairy bordered this creek. The cows drank from it. In 1923, we're jumping forward, Jamestown now has a population of 40,000 residents. Okay, so for 40,000 people, all that sewage, untreated, is being dumped into Cassadaga Creek. It's also an exceptionally dry year. In June of 1923, there's a typhoid epidemic that breaks out. And tracing where the sick illnesses occur, very quickly it's identified that it's the route of the Forbes dairy. November 1923, so several months later, Forbes hires young Robert Jackson to sue the city of Jamestown, and I'll tell you why they felt the need to do that in a bit. Very quickly, they hire him in May 1923. November 1923. In May of 1924, there is the conclusion of the first trial. The verdict is for the Forbes, and there are several, sort of a tortured appeals process, and there's an appeal which is also won. So May 1925, the second trial, again, verdict for the Forbes. After that, the floodgates open and several towns and individuals come forward and sue the city of Jamestown. And then some years later, after that, Jamestown does finally build a sewage treatment plant, so they're not dumping raw waste. And I would like to say that a lot of the facts here I have gotten from an excellent white paper written by Mary D. Tutochi. Tell me when I get these wrong. Okay, so the Forbes dairy, just to paint the picture, it's Grant Forbes and his son Merle. Together they have 164 acres along the banks of the Cassadaga. Merle's wife, Ida, is bedridden as she's pregnant. This is important coming up, and delivers her baby 1 month after the outbreak. So after the Forbes dairy was identified, the city of Jamestown directed them to stop selling milk, to personally cease contact with the dairy operation, and to begin to pasteurize. So they were not pasteurizing at the time. This was a big case. People died, and the Forbes were very publicly identified, so they really had considerable damage to their reputation. Okay, and just incidentally, it was 1947 that the first state required pasteurization. So we're in the 20s. We're 20-some years before that. This was not an extraordinary thing that they weren't pasteurizing. So let's just paint the picture of Cassadaga Creek and typhoid. So what you see there, that is human feces. It was just floating, and they had several expert witnesses and others who testified as to the nature of the creek. And one gentleman from Kyantone, this is the quote: "Fecal matter from the city of Jamestown would gather itself in bunches. There were spots near the Forbes farm, 16 feet in length by 2 to 10 feet in width, of nothing but human manure, in which you could put a stick down 3 feet. The odor was abhorrent, the flies were thick." Okay, so we'll get by that now. After we painted that picture. A couple facts about typhoid. It thrives in milk. The bacteria thrives in milk. However, when a cow drinks from a contaminated source, the stomach and the processes is such that it is not transmitted through the milk. So that sort of obvious pathway was not available. It was known that was not how the typhoid got in the milk. And then one aspect of this is that Ida, bedridden at 8 months pregnant, was identified as a carrier. They did a ton of testing, sending it up to multiple labs in Buffalo and down to DC. She's a carrier because she, as a nurse, did work caring for typhoid patients 1917 to 1920. Okay, so at the trials, there are 3 main areas of contention here. One is the condition of the creek. How bad was it? Well, as you can see, Jackson did a tremendous amount of documentation and proved without a doubt that it was in horrible condition. The cause of the epidemic, was it the feces in the creek or was it Ida? And then what were the damages to the dairy? So Jamestown, needless to say, said the source of contamination was Ida Forbes and poor hygiene at the dairy. Now, the Forbes ran quite a professional sort of operation at the time, but anyhow, so this was the Jamestown's case. The Forbes said that it was the dumping of the raw sewage that caused damage. How the pathway got there, no one really knows. Ida was dismissed as a carrier because, being bedridden, she did not have any contact with the milk at that time, at the time of the outbreak. So we're left to wonder how it was. It could be that it got on the cow's udders and it wasn't completely cleaned, but that would be a standard of care sort of beyond the normal. It could have even been flies, which really are hard to contain in a dairy operation. So Jackson won both trials and secured a modest judgment, which there are probably a lot of reasons for that, but the Forbes did regain their reputation and have some compensation for their losses. So the purpose that I go through, other than to have a really kind of clear tie-in with Jackson here, is I want to leave you with some, and I'm sure that Professor Shelley will show you others, but as we go through this, you can be sort of mulling. If you think about this purely in financial terms, I mean, we don't look at the distress, we don't look at the suffering. For the typhoid outbreak, there were 35 people made very sick by this. 2 died. So how are you going to sort of assess what that cost is? You have insurance actuarial tables, loss of income, cost of and to caregivers, hospital medical costs, and it goes on. You had the initial investigation by the staff. You had the loss already described by the Forbes. You had 2 trials and 2 trips to the appellate division. So for both sides, you have attorneys and staff fees for the trial with preparation and exhibits, expert witnesses that had to come in 3 times. They came in from Chicago. At this point, this is like a 2-day trip each way, so you're paying somebody for like a week. So they brought in experts from Boston and New York and Chicago, and you're paying their travel expenses. The judge and the staff, and the cost to the juries. So, and then you have the subsequent lawsuits and all of that cost versus the sewage treatment plant cost and operation of the construction and operation cost. So just leave you with that thought. And I would like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Michael Shelley of the University of Buffalo, and he's at the Renew Institute, which is a university-wide interdisciplinary research institute that focuses on complex environmental issues as well as the social and economic issues with which they are connected. Dr. Shelley is an environmental economist with over 25 years of experience who has analyzed a wide variety of projects on 5 continents. Dr. Shelley values the environmental benefits associated with both natural and engineered systems and also has valued the health impacts of pollution. So with that, you want to come up and I'm going to figure out.
And tonight I'm going to give you a presentation on the value of water from an economic perspective. So I'm going to get this thing going. All right. But before we get going, I thought I'd put it in context. You may not be able to see it very well from the back, but what we have here is, oops, sorry, you won't see it at all if I do that. There we go. Wrong button. But what we have here in the background is a sort of an outline of the United States. So there are the Great Lakes. Can anyone see that? Can you see the pointer?
Talk to the mic.
Okay. You can't hear me, but you can see that. Okay. So here, what we have is we have the United States. This here is the Great Lakes. And this here represents all the water on Earth. Okay, all of it. Whether it's underground, in the sea, ice caps, wherever. This here is all the fresh water, all the stuff you can drink. And you see it's only a small sphere compared to that. This is all the water in the lakes and the rivers, of which approximately 21% is in the Great Lakes. So you get the sense that the stuff that you can drink is a really minuscule part of all the water there is in the world. We're lucky here because we've got 21% of the world's supply of fresh water on our doorstep. So we're in a rather privileged position. Okay, now how do you value water? It depends upon your philosophy. There's two distinct ways of looking at it. One way is to say that nature has inherent rights. And when you take that point of view, like the First Nations and the tribes, you regard water as being sacred or a living entity, and you don't see it as a resource which people are entitled to use for their own benefit. It has rights of its own. And then you become more of a custodian, and the idea is that you should look after your water bodies. Okay, you should not harm them, because you depend on them and they depend on you. So under this point of view, humans have a responsibility to the earth and the lakes, and we've got to stop destroying them or harming them. You can imagine if you have that philosophy, you would treat water in a very different way from the way we've been treating it here in the last 200 years. Now, the point of view I am going to talk about tonight is the economic point of view, which is much more narrow. From the economics point of view, we're interested in how people make use of water, and we value water in as much as it satisfies human needs and wants. Okay? So that's just the way economists do things. And then to get very specific, we look at how much people are willing to pay for water. We say that the maximum willingness to pay for water expresses your value in monetary terms. Okay? So that's the whole basis of environmental economics, is looking at how people use the environment and how much they're willing to pay to use environmental resources. Okay, so how do humans value water, or how do they use water? Well, the most obvious way is we consume it, we drink it. Okay, that's one way in which we get value from water. Second way is that we use it as a production input. If you're making beer or got a manufacturing process, you're going to end up using water, so we use it as a production input. Another way we use it is not so salutary. We use it as a waste sink. We dump stuff in it. Okay, we just saw that in that slide. Huh? And another way we use water is we use it as a source of pleasure or recreation, or just simply aesthetic value for the views. So those are the four ways in which we use water. And I'm going to tell you now how you place a value from those four perspectives, and I'm going to give you some examples. Now, when I talk about values, I'm talking about the total willingness to pay for water, and it has a number of components. There are use values. Use values is where you directly use the water, and that's like consuming it, using it in a production input, or actually taking to the water on a boat or going fishing. You're directly using it. But people also value resources simply for their existence. This is going back to that other definition of the value of water. So all the things in purple are what are called non-use values or passive use values. So you might value water, even if you're not using, say, a lake, you might value its existence because someday you might want to go and visit. Okay? Or if it's a rainforest, you might want to know it exists because one day you might want to go and see the thing. So you're not using it today, you're not contacting it today, but you might in the future. These sort of non-use values are where you never intend to use it. So we might care about the ice in Antarctica. We're never going to go there, but we would like to believe it's going to exist. We think it's got a right to exist, and so we're willing to pay something towards its preservation. So when we give money to charities, environmental charities, we're often acting on this impulse, on this valuation. We may never go to these places, but we want to know they exist. Sometimes we want to know simply that we derive, I call it pleasure or satisfaction from the knowledge they're going to exist. And sometimes we like to think that we're leaving nature to future generations, and that's what's known as a bequest value. So those are all the ways in which you can capture people's values for various resources. Okay, what about consumption then? I just put things in context. Great Lakes. This big circle, you can see where I got this idea from. This big circle represents all the water in the Great Lakes. The little red one is all the water that we withdraw from the Great Lakes for any reason. The tiny little black dot is all the water we withdraw but never put back. It doesn't go back in any way. Right? So if you drink it and it goes into the sanitary system, it goes back. But if you put it in a bottle and you export that bottle of water, it never returns. So the point I'm trying to make here is, in terms of consumption, that's not a big use around here. We don't consume much water relative to the stock. If we were in other places, if we were in Cape Town at the moment, we'd have a very different view of the role of consumption as compared to stocks. So here we don't have a shortage of water, is the point. Okay? A little bit of economics here, because I'm an economist, I can't resist this stuff. How do you value the water that people consume? Well, you simply ask for their maximum willingness to pay. So what you do is you say, for a given quantity of water, how much would you be willing to pay rather than go without? That's called your maximum willingness to pay. And this is the stuff we do, in economics classes. We have a demand curve. A demand curve shows a negative relationship between the price of something and the quantity consumed. And what we do is we look at the price. So this is the price per gallon of water. This is the price that people pay. And at that price, this is how much people will consume. So that's the value of the last gallon. What's the total value of the water that people consume? It consists of two parts. It's what people pay, and it's this other part you may never have heard of called consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is that feeling you get when you buy something and you think it was a bargain. I would have been willing to pay more for that. That's that psychic satisfaction you get. Okay? That's that extra bit. So when you're trying to value the water that's being consumed, you don't just look at what people pay for it. It's also this other part, this bit that they would have been willing to pay, the consumer surplus. Okay? And that turns out to be very important. When you're working as a professional economist and you're working on environmental claims, one of the things you make a claim for is not just this part, but also consumer surplus, that's sort of the psychic value, the utility that people lost when the resource was damaged. Here's something we always go through in introductory economics classes, which is the water diamond paradox. Going back 200 odd years now, almost 250, Adam Smith made this observation that water is a necessity. Without water, we die. Diamonds are not a necessity. No one needs a diamond. Yet the price of water is so low compared to the price of diamonds. How can this be? And it got a big argument going in economics for 200 years about the difference between the price of something and the value of something. And the way it got resolved in the end is to look at the margin on the edge. The thing about water is it's in very large supply, so we can consume a lot of it, so that the extra sort of satisfaction we get from the last gallon we consume is quite small. Given that satisfaction is going to drive our demand, it gets translated into the price. We're not willing to pay much more for the next gallon of water simply because we've had so much of it so far. We've satisfied our need. Diamonds, on the other hand, are rare. So we don't have so many diamonds that we're not interested very much in getting the next one. So even the water has a tremendous value in total to us. On the margin, it's when people are consuming it, they don't place a great deal of value on that last gallon consumed. How do you value it in production? Well, you recognize this diagram as the same idea. The way you look at it from a firm's point of view is you look at how the value of output changes as you vary the amount of water they use. Right? So obviously, if their product's very expensive, then they value water more because they get more revenue from selling the product they make with the water. Okay? Just as with the consumers, though, the more water they have on hand, the less the value of the next unit. Okay, and that's the downward sloping curve. So when you're looking at what's the value to local companies of the water, same as with consumers, it's not just how much they paid. It's also this extra value they got. They sold the product and it was worth more than the water content, as it were. There's that extra bit as well. So water's worth more to producers than simply the amount they pay for it. Okay? Now, in the last few years, there's been much talk about something called the blue economy. Anyone heard of the blue economy? Okay. In Michigan, a few years ago, the state government decided it wanted to examine the value of the water supply, in other words, the lakes, to the economy. And so they put out a report called the Blue Economy Report, and it listed a number of ways in which water contributed to economic production. So there are the traditional ways, which we're all familiar with, such as commercial and freight shipping. Okay, that still goes on. There's still a tremendous amount of stuff that gets shipped on the lakes. It's mostly bulky, low-value stuff like aggregate and minerals, but it still goes on. Commercial fishing, not so important anymore. What did used to be a big industry until the fish stocks declined. But it is still used a lot in farming and agriculture. People withdraw water from the lakes for their, to water their farms. Also used in manufacturing, energy production. The way it's used in energy production, it's used for cooling water for power plants. Okay, that's not usually much of an extractive use because they return a lot of it to the lake. And in a very minor thing, it's used in beverage production. More recently, in Michigan at least, they've refocused back on water, and they're trying to develop the new sectors. The new sectors are things such as water technology businesses. This would be water filtration, water supply, water pipes, that sort of stuff. Anything where water is the focus of the company. Then they say water research and learning. They have a number of Great Lakes centers and water centers in their universities. And finally, they're talking about climate change and the fact that as the rest of the country warms up and water supplies become tight in other areas, this area is going to become relatively attractive because it still have 21% of the world's water, fresh water. So that's becoming a locational advantage here that wasn't the case in the past. That as the rest of the country warms up, there will be shortages. And this area is going to have a reliable source of water, which if you're looking to locate a manufacturing plant or you're wanting to live here, would be a great advantage. They claim, when they did their study, that in Michigan, water in one way or the other supports nearly 1 million jobs, a substantial number, and that it supports about $60 billion in economic activity. And that was in 2010. So it's really, it's a substantial contribution to their economy. And in Buffalo, people have been talking about the blue economy. The Renew Institute that I work at, they've got a focus area that's called freshwater coastal ecosystems and the blue economy. The idea that we can start to use the lakes here as a basis for an improvement in the economy. How do you value water in its role as a waste sink? Well, the problem is you don't, in a sense. There used to be, at least, especially back in the 20s, until environmental legislation was passed, we're going to hear about that, there was no price for using water bodies as a waste sink. You could pump stuff in, and companies did. All sorts of wastes, mercury, PCBs, heavy metals, sewage sludge, organic material from paper making, from leather making. They just dumped it in the nearest lake or the nearest river, out of sight, out of mind. And this is an example of what economists call an externality. This is where an externality occurs when you impose a cost on somebody else, but you don't bear that cost. Okay. So, for instance, with this example here, the city of Jamestown was imposing a cost on the dairy operation. It was putting sewage into the water which their cattle drank, and that was imposing a cost on them. But the city didn't take that cost into account. Since it didn't take that cost into account, it didn't see the need to build a wastewater treatment plant. Okay. And when you've got a situation where people don't have to pay for the use of something, they tend to use it obviously more heavily than they would otherwise, and they can use it to excess. And then you get too much waste and you get environmental problems. I'm going to give you some examples of some environmental problems. The first one here is contaminated sites. Around the Great Lakes, there are what are called areas of concern. This is where there were formerly manufacturing sites and they dumped their waste into the lake. That's why they're all along the coasts. Okay? We've got a few in Buffalo. Niagara River is a famous one. These areas are contaminated, and that means that their use is impaired. Impaired in the sense that you can't fish, or you can't boat, or you can't swim, or you can't use as a water source. These are legacy problems. Back in the old days, you didn't have to pay, so people just dumped waste into the waters, and now we have to deal with it. And it's really expensive to pull that waste out. You have to dredge it out. You have to transport it away. You then have to restore the ecosystem. It's really expensive. There are something like 43 of these. As I say, there are 43, only a few of which have actually been fully cleaned up. Okay, so it's a remaining problem. Another area where we've got a waste disposal problem was one time, up until quite recently, it was legal for companies to dump ballast water from their ships into the Great Lakes. So they would go off, they would pick up the cargo in Europe, or Europe it was, and they would pick up water there, and they would simply come to the Great Lakes, and when they got here, they'd discharge it. And the result was they discharged whatever was in that water. And that's why we have these creatures now. We have the quagga mussels and the zebra mussels. And they are extensive. They're in all of these lakes. There's only this one here, Superior, that doesn't have them. And I went to a presentation at UB. One of the biologists was showing pictures of the bottoms of the lake. He built this sled thing, and he goes along and he takes pictures. And it's, in certain areas, it's absolutely coated with these mussels that didn't used to be there. They are very good filter feeders. They pull out all the nutrients out of the water, which is good for them, not so good for the other fish. Okay. Also, because they pull the nutrients out, the sunlight gets through, and it causes algae blooms. So this is an example of people not paying the proper price for the use of the Great Lakes as a waste repository. Oops, sorry, I've done it again. Hold on a second. Don't do that again. All right, hold on. I think there's something wrong with this presentation. I think this is an earlier one. Hold on a second. We've got a 10. Yeah, you got the wrong one. Just zoom through this so we get back to where we were. This is a slightly different version of the same thing. Okay, yep. Okay, so I shortened this, believe it or not. Okay, the third problem. Oops, no, did it again. Hold on a second. Third problem, algal blooms. As you may have heard, Toledo a couple of years, about 3 or 4 years ago, they couldn't use their water for 2 days because of these algal blooms. The reason being that the algal blooms, the algae, they grow, and when they die, they take the oxygen from the water, they make it very brown, they fill it full of toxins, you can't drink the water. It also kills off, if there's enough algae in one place, when it dies off, the bacteria consume the algae, that takes oxygen out of the water, it kills the fish. Okay, and sometimes the fish are killed directly by the toxins. I remember a couple of years ago walking in Canada, and a guy there told me he was told not to put his dog in the lake because the algae were there and there were toxins and it could be dangerous for the dog. So, and then what causes the algal blooms is the high level of plant nutrients in the water. And the plant nutrients come from sources such as agriculture and from sewage treatment plants, principally. And the one that really causes the problem is phosphorus. It's the one that limits the growth of the algae. And the levels of phosphorus in, for instance, Lake Erie have been going back up again. They cut them down in the 70s by doing things like taking phosphorus out of dishwasher detergent and installing treatment systems at wastewater plants. But now it's being overwhelmed by the amounts of phosphorus that are coming in from places, from sources such as agriculture. So once again, it's an example of the lakes being used as a waste sink, and we're overusing them. In other words, we're exceeding nature's capacity to assimilate the waste. Now, a few years ago, there was a study done, a cost-benefit study, of how much it would cost to clean up the Great Lakes, to get a sense of, is it worth it? Right? Because if you undertake any activity to clean up the lakes, you've got to pay for it. The question is the value of that cleanup worth it? And the answer was yes. They looked at, under this plan, they were looking at various ways of cleaning up the lake, such as eliminating discharges of untreated wastewater, protecting drinking water sources, remediating those sites I talked about, restoring the wetlands, all of that stuff. And the cost was estimated to be $32 billion in today's money. Then they looked at the benefits, and they tried to do their best to look at the various types of benefits, and there were some of them they couldn't quantify. But the ones they could quantify included things like improvements in water-based recreation, which was valued at something like $2.5 to $3.7 billion. Okay. And then here's one that's interesting. Increased property values near beaches with clear water, that's $3 billion. Safeguarding recreational fishing, that was up to 7.4 billion because there's a huge amount of recreational fishing on the lakes, and so on and so forth. Another one here was increased property values near contaminated sites as those areas are concerned. The point is that there are a number of ways in which we'd all benefit from a cleaner lake, and it would be captured in things such as property values. So anyone who lives near a lake, your property value would go up if that lake was cleaner. Okay? You would capture some of that benefit. And then there was some unquantified benefits they had related to attractiveness to business, and they sort of put a fudge number in for that. And that's how they got to 62 billion. How do you value the recreational beach use? Okay, the fact that people go to the beach. Well, you use some sophisticated economic techniques, and what you do is you collect statistics on people's visits to beaches, and you look at the characteristics of the beaches, and you look at how much it costs people to get to the beach, whether it be their travel cost or whether it be some sort of access fee. And you put that all into a statistical model, and it gives you an indication. You can figure out how much people value their beach use. Okay? You can back that out. And so this is a study of looking at what would happen if beaches were closed. If people lost access to the beach, how much value would they lose? And it relates to, the bits I've chosen relate to the western end of Lake Erie. And they found that if you closed one beach for the whole season, the season is from May through to September, if you closed it, the value lost to people would be something like $2.3 million for a beach. That's substantial. If you closed all of the beaches in the western end of Lake Erie, the value then would be something like $2.5 million a day, and it would be something like $300 million for the whole season. So it's pretty substantial value. So you get some sense of how much people value access to the beach. It's in the hundreds of millions just for this part of the lake. And then another way to look at it is you can look at valuing recreational boat use, because as you may have seen, lots of boats on the lakes. The US Army Corps of Engineers did this one, and they looked at the number of boats, and they categorized them by size, and then they did a survey, and they found out how much people spent on their boat for a given size of boat, and how much they spent on trips, and how many trips they made, and then they worked that all out, and then they got numbers on the number of boats, and then they put it through something called an input-output model. What that does is, when you go and buy something, if you buy a car, for instance, not only are you generating activity at the car factory, obviously the tire manufacturer has to make the tires, the people who make the windscreens have to make the windscreens, so the people who make the electronics have to make the electronics, and their suppliers have to make things to supply to them. So you're setting off a whole chain of economic activity. Right? So typically in the economy, for every dollar final demand, every dollar we go and spend, you're creating something like $2.50 worth of total economic activity. And the way they figure that out is through this model, which looks at the linkages between sectors. How much money does the car manufacturer spend on tires? How much money does the tire manufacturer spend on rubber? And so forth. Okay, they trace it all the way back. So what they did here was they looked at the spending by boat owners, and then they looked at all those multiplier effects and added the whole lot together. And they found that the annual impact in the Great Lakes states of recreational boating, they estimated to be something like $27.5 billion. Once you take those multiplier effects into account. So it's a huge value. And just in New York State alone, it's something like 3.6 billion, according to their study. Okay? So it's some big numbers here. What about fishing? Fishing is a big activity, as you know, here on the lakes. So there was a study done a few years ago by the US Army Corps of Engineers, and they were looking at what would happen if invasive species got into the lake. They were mostly interested in the golden carp. This is you ever seen the pictures of the thing that jumps out of the water, the big fish? Well, there's a concern it's going to get into the Great Lakes. So a study was done to look at what value was at risk from the invasive species. And it's called the GLMRIS study, Great Lakes and Mississippi River Interbasin Study. And Cornell University actually did the work for the Army Corps of Engineers. And so the way they did this at Cornell was they did a survey of fishermen, and they got their total expenditures. Fishermen spend quite a lot of money, if you think about it, because not only do they have to buy their equipment, they got their transport costs to get there, they buy bait, some of them stay overnight, some of them rent boats. There's quite a lot of expenditure. Then they did, similar to the study I showed you before for the beaches, they did a travel cost model. And what they do is you interview fishermen, where did you come from, where are you staying, and they get some sense of their expenditures, and they can back out their value then, the value they place on fishing. And yet again, they use an input-out model, like I talked about before, where you take the initial spending and you see how it sort of moves through the economy and how much extra activity it generates. And this is what they came up with. So these are all in billions. $6.4 billion of fishermen's expenditures per year in the Great Lakes. So a huge number. The consumer surplus, remember that bit you don't pay for, that value that you've derived even though you're not paying for it, as it were? From the travel cost study, they figured out that was another 1.3 billion. So you add those two together, and the total value to fishermen, remember that area under the demand curve? $7.7 billion a year. With looking at it from the whole economy's point of view, how much economic activity does recreational fishing lead to? Well, you start with your expenditures, 6.4 million. Then there's all these other multiplier effects. I was talking about where the suppliers have to supply stuff and the money moves around the economy. Those are something like 9 million. So the total value to the US economy of recreational fishing in the Great Lakes is something like $15.4 billion a year. So hopefully I've convinced you that water has tremendous value. Okay, in many ways.
We're looking at this, of course, from various perspectives. And the next, because this is the Jackson Center and it's about law, will be the legal perspective from Professor Kim Diana Connolly of UB Law School. Professor Connolly studies, writes, and speaks about environmental and animal law policies, creatively examining and sharing ideas as to how to move toward a sustainable future. She is UB Law's Director of Clinical Legal Education, Director of the Advocacy Institute, and Vice Dean for Advocacy and Experiential Education. She practices law, supervising student attorneys on local environmental matters through the law school's Environmental Law Clinic. Professor Connolly's research focus includes environmental law, international law, law and science, law and social science, and natural resources law. Professor Connolly.
Thank you so much to the Jackson Center for having me here, a boring old lawyer. And I'm going to talk a little about, I know, I'm going to stand right here, which is very hard for me. But I'm going to talk a little about valuing water and whether laws and regulations are helpful or not. And we're going to explore that a little together. So how I'm going to do that is I'm going to just have you envision a couple of stories before we get to, I'm going to talk a little about what law is. I'm going to talk particularly about some laws, one of the most important that came from some of the things like the Forbes case, the Clean Water Act, and I study and write about that. At the end of that, I'm going to get a little bit into ecosystem services, a little about politics, and then I'm going to circle back to this question that I posed back here, which is, are we valuable when we have these laws? I have 26 slides, but there are lots of pictures, so it's not going to be daunting, although there is some legal language. So I just want you to take a minute as we're all sitting here together to think about some of your favorite stories in your life and whether water's been involved. Go to some of the things that Dr. Shelley was talking about and think about what happened for you recently or in the long past that involved water that was wonderful. What stories of your life? Do you remember things from your childhood? Do you remember things from last summer? Do you remember things from frozen water recently? One of the places that I've chosen to put pictures of here is the Niagara Falls and the Niagara River. It was mentioned that I work with students in clinics. One of the projects that my clinic students have been working on for a couple of years, and we're getting so close to having this happen, is to have the Niagara River corridor designated under an international treaty as a water and wetland of international importance, both on the U.S. side and the Canadian side. So that's some of the things that my law students in my clinic are working on. And one of the things that we've learned a lot, my students have learned a lot about what values are involved there. So now that we're kind of, let's thinking about that, let's think about what law has to do with it. What is law? I mean, it's this construct that we've created from long ago. But when we usually think of law, we think of, well, we have a constitution, there's a bunch of laws that are passed by Congress or by the Assembly, and then there's regulations, and there's guidance, and then there's how this all evolves. And so I'm going to kind of circle back into some of the laws that are relevant to this. And to really get down to a law that still exists today, I'm going to start with a really old law. The historic law that deals with waters is our Rivers and Harbors Act. It was passed in 1899. It still exists today, and it was passed, and it's supposed to be about, and it is about, construction of bridges, causeways, dams, and dikes. You can't do that. You can't construct them without permission. You need a permit. And why did you need that back in the 1800s? Well, because the Department of War, back before there was a Department of the Army or anything, there was a Department of War, wanted to make sure that everything was available if they needed to protect waterways or protect people by using waterways to do that. So the whole focus of this was the navigable capacity of our nation's waters. And to this day, they still issue permits, particularly under this, although they use the same permitting scheme as the Clean Water Act, and most of the same people work on it, but it is still an active law today. But the act that really comes to mind when one is thinking about water, and that's what we're looking at today, is the Clean Water Act. And in fact, it is cases like the Forbes case that we heard about that led to this very law. And I want to help people who haven't thought anywhere near as much about laws as I've gotten to do in environmental law, is what's going on with the Clean Water Act is it's governing what we put out. This is different than the Safe Drinking Water Act. We have a whole other act about what water that is sold or put out to us to drink has to involve. The Clean Water Act governs when we're discharging. So let's talk a little about where this act came from. It was first enacted in this thing that we now call the Clean Water Act in 1972. And what was happening in the 70s? We were creating all these laws to protect the environment. Well, actually, the first one, the National Environmental Policy Act, was in 1969. But most of the environmental laws that we gave birth to as a nation came through Congress in the 70s and kind of very beginning of the 80s. The Clean Water Act was something that Congress created to say, what we need is we need a structure for regulating discharges of pollutants, just like you heard about in the Forbes case, into waters of the United States, and to regulate water quality standards for surface waters. It actually built on an existing set of laws, as I'm going to talk about in a minute, and a lot of state laws. A lot of states had already been doing things, but it was really different in different states. So some of what happened is people would go seeking areas that was easier to do things in states that had less regulation, and so it was decided that we needed to federalize this, and we needed to get something that was going to help us for all of our waters. And so the Clean Water Act, Congress said it's going to be unlawful to discharge any pollutant from a point source into navigable waters without a permit. And so therefore, there were lawyers involved, so then we had to spend a lot of years, and we still talk a lot about, as I'm going to get to, what point sources are, what navigable waters are, so we're going to talk about that. So we had the Federal Water Pollution Control Act from the 1940s, but it was state-based and not really, didn't have a lot. And so they created this, they really reorganized it, they expanded it, and that's when it got the nickname, the Clean Water Act, although if you're actually citing it, that's not its real name. And it implemented pollution control measures, and it allowed states to take from the federal government the governance of this, and it also created national water quality criteria. So it said you have to do this stuff to get a permit, and by the way, in addition to saying you have to get permits for certain things, we're going to say certain waters have to be cleaned up to a certain level. What are people doing with this water? And therefore, if you're fishing or swimming in it, it has to be cleaner than if you're using it for other uses. And so there's a lot of controversy that's gone on in what that means over time. Oh my goodness, this is my worst slide. So I just wanted to read to you because it's fun to think about Congress. Congress so excited in the 1970s, like, we're going to fix pollution. This is the coolest thing. We've had Earth Day. This is fun. We're going to do this. We are going to enact an act whose objective is to restore and maintain the the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. Those of us who, I worked in private practice before I came into academia, but those of us who work on the side of the people who are trying to protect, quote this all the time. We love this line about what the purpose of the Clean Water Act is. And then it says, hey, so here's what you're going to do, world, because we're Congress, not whole world, just the U.S., but Congress thinks the U.S. is the whole world. Anyways, it's a national goal that the discharge of pollutants into the navigable waters be eliminated by 1985. Yeah, we didn't do that. It's a national goal that wherever attainable, an interim goal of water quality which provides for the protection and propagation of shellfish, fish, wildlife, provides for recreation, shall be achieved by July 1st, 1983. It's a national policy that the discharge of toxic pollutants in toxic amounts be prohibited. Yeah. It's the national policy that federal financial assistance be provided to construct publicly owned waste treatment works. That actually worked really well through the 80s and the beginning of the 90s. But we're not spending that much federal money on that. We've not got revolving loan funds and all sorts of other ways that we do that, and so they're not providing as much federal financial assistance. It's a national policy that an area-wide waste treatment management planning processes be developed and implemented to assure adequate control of sources of pollutants in each state. We're still working on that one too. It's a national policy that major research and demonstration effort be made to develop technology necessary to eliminate the discharge of pollutants into navigable waters, waters of the contiguous zone, and the oceans. I would say that there's been efforts to do this, but I would say that the funding of science to really do this has been diminished radically. It's a national policy that programs to control non-point source pollutions be developed and implemented in an expeditious manner, back in 1972, to enable the goals of the Act to be met through the control of both point and non-point sources of pollution. We still really suck at non-point sources of pollution. So yeah, so this is out there. However, when you've been to law school, you learn kind of after your first month, you're very disappointed to learn that the Purposes Act, when Congress sets out its broad goals, isn't really what ever gets enforced, although people go back to it and they talk about it a lot. So it's a lovely thing that they wanted to do. And we always still talk about restoring and maintaining the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. But what really happens is there's this law out there, and then there's lots and lots of sections. My professor, I have an environmental master's after you get your JD. My professor who taught me the Clean Water Act said, don't ever sit down and read the whole Clean Water Act because it doesn't make sense. It's all put together, it's all jumbled. And it really is. It's not a fun act to read. Some acts are. The Endangered Species Act's really fun. If you have an afternoon, go read it. It's really fun. It's coherent. You can pull it together. Clean Water Act's really jumbled. But then what happens is there's this act and there's lots of regulations. And so if you go and you just search regulations.gov, if you've never been there, it's a fun place to go for people like me, and maybe for some of you. But if you go and you search Clean Water Act under regulations.gov, and I just did this yesterday, you get over 14,000 things that are in the regulations.gov, including things you can comment on, things that are happening, and existing regulations that are codified in one of my favorite things to read, the Code of Federal Regulations, the CFR. I'm not joking, I really like reading it. So they made me a law professor. But anyway, so there's lots of things going on. So we've got this major law, and then we've got tons of regulations, and not even this. Then we have all these uncodified guidance documents that are out there, so I'm going to be talking about a little bit of those in just a minute. So let's go down to one area, the area that I study and write about the most, which is Section 404 of the Clean Water Act that's meant to protect wetlands and other waters of the United States. And that's where I'm going to really drill down just for a minute into values. So the Secretary, and that means the Secretary of the Army, may issue permits after notice and opportunity for public hearing for the discharge or dredged or fill material into navigable waters at specified disposal sites. If you're taking a whole course in wetlands law from me, you'd spend like a day on each of these sections, but for now we're not going to do that. We're going to just talk a little about this term navigable waters, because do you remember just a couple minutes ago I said navigable waters to you from the 1899 language? So you know what? It was so helpful, because if you're ever learning law, you have to say, where do I go to figure out what they meant? I go to the definition section. And I didn't reprint this because it's really easy. What does the definition in the Clean Water say about this navigable waters? Does it mean the same thing as the Rivers and Harbors Act, which talks about the ebb and flow of the tide? Or is it something new? And so Congress helpfully put in the definition section, navigable waters shall be waters of the United States. So guess what we've been fighting about since the 70s? What that means. And it actually means different things in different parts of the country because waters are different. And so when we're talking about waters here, it's really different than you're talking about things in Hawaii or Arizona. So the Corps of Engineers, which is the primary regulator of this, has very many districts and divisions. We're actually in the Great Lakes and Ohio River Division, which would be logical. And so the things that happened here were really surprising to me. I worked for years in DC, then I spent a decade and got my tenure in South Carolina. And when I came here, I had to learn the new rules of how the same language was interpreted because there are specific guidance documents that go to each area that help us in clarifying, only not really, because then we get to sue a lot about it, about what it means to deal with this navigable water. So let's just take a little tour, because if you've been following anything about the Clean Water Act, this is the fight. This is the fight of the day. Navigable waters and the current jurisdictional debate. So navigable waters is based on, those are out of order. I wanted to tell you about the Corps of Engineers. The Corps of Engineers is this great people. They've been around since they were the Department of War. I have good friends who work for the Corps of Engineers with great hearts. But they have regulatory program goals, which they specifically say are equally important, and there's no meaning to the order in which they are listed, and they go by this when they're making decisions as to whether to issue a permit, to provide strong protection of the nation's aquatic environment, including wetlands, to enhance the efficiency of the Corps administration of its regulatory program, and to ensure that the Corps provides the regulated public with fair and reasonable decisions. And quite frankly, the way that those get interpreted as which is a little tiny bit more important, even though say they're not important, depends on the politics of the day. So we start back when we're thinking about what does this mean? We go all the way back to our founding thing when we're thinking about federal laws. What does the Constitution say? You have to have a commerce connection, so we've had fights about this. Fights about what means navigable. We've been to the Supreme Court 3 times. First of all, the first thing that they said is unanimously, as far as the Commerce Clause would allow, everywhere that the Commerce Clause would do it, you go regulate. You go, Corps of Engineers. And the Corps of Engineers said, we think that might piss some people off. So they kind of arranged a backdoor thing where some people would sue them, and then they got another decision made. So they got some things going on. So they had this set of things, and then they're like, wow, if we're supposed to go really far, we're gonna say everywhere migratory birds go, because they're part of commerce, right? I mean, we just heard about that. They're definitely a part of commerce, totally. So then people were like, yeah, no, that's too far. So then there was another Supreme Court decision, which was a really tight 5-4 decision, which was very unclear, said migratory bird rule not allowed, go think again. And then the court didn't do much different, although there were lots of guidance documents and meetings and lawsuits. And so then there was another decision, which came down in 2005, and that's when the Corps of Engineers was trying to regulate somebody who'd won all these environmental awards, and they brought this thing in, and they're like, yeah, we're really not gonna be doing this. And then this other bad actor as well, and they brought these 2 cases together, and the case came down. It was a plurality decision. It was 4-1-4, and so now that left a lot of messes. One of the things that one of the Supreme Court concurrences said is, you gotta go fix the regulations because it's all messed up. So they went off after fits and starts and finally created this thing called the Clean Water Rule. The Clean Water Rule, as you know, the waters of the United States rulemaking, because remember, that's how it's defined, navigable waters that we regulate are the waters of the United States. So it's this Clean Water Rule that literally it took 8 years to figure it out. They had scientific panels, but the thing that's neat about this, and you can go read all about the history of this, the thing that's really neat about the way that they did this is they really did do a lot of science. They really did a lot of science. There was lots of litigation going on as this was happening, but there was lots of science that went on. And you know, this is just a picture of the Scientific Advisory Board's consideration of the adequacy of the scientific and technical basis of the EPA's proposed rule. They had all their ducks in a row. They depended on people. They depended not just on the scientists, they depended on economists. They depended on a lot of people to make sure that this rule was going to be a good defensible rule. And at the end of the day, when they finally issued this rule, all of us were pissed off, which that's how you know it's a good rule. If the regulated community is pissed off and the people who defend the entities that are all for the environment where Birkenstocks are pissed off, then the Corps of Engineers and the EPA has done a good job. And so that went out, and immediately lawsuits ensued. And then things were put on hold, and then things happened, and then we thought we were getting to some sort of clarity, and everything had been consolidated, and then we got a new president, who very shortly after arriving in February issued an executive order on restoring the rule of law, federalism, and economic growth by reviewing the Waters of the United States rule. And it takes an hour for me to explain what happened here, so I'm just going to cut to the chase of basically what they decided to do is they decided to take apart the existing rule, which under the Administrative Procedure Act, if you have a rule that's gone through all the processes, taking it apart is really hard. Simultaneously propose a notice of proposed rulemaking for a new rule and confuse the heck out of people because we're doing it all at the same time. And those of us who've really looked at it, and when I go talk with other professors, we all unpack it and we all kind of laugh about this. And then they've kind of said, we're going to do all this kind of stuff. And so they've got all this stuff out there. And then, woohoo, lawsuits everywhere. Litigating on that rule. Those are still out there. Then litigating on the new rule of what it will be applying to. Litigating on whether, I said it was going to go away, the rescission rule. And then litigating on the step 2, which is we're going to make a new rule. And literally there's like dozens of lawsuits out there all happening at the same time. People who are very happy are people who like get paid to bring lawsuits about this. That's kind of cool. But the regulated community and the people who care about these resources are very confused as to what's happening. There's a lot of uncertainty out there. I just spoke on this last week, and it was very interesting because literally the day after we'd made a presentation on this, the EPA came up and said, oh, yeah, so we're going to like reopen the rescission rule and do a little bit more Administrative Procedure Act work on it. And we're like, wow, it's kind of weird that came out the day after we did this major presentation with the head of the Office of Water, Wetlands, and Oceans, Water, and Watersheds and Wetlands, but good for them. And that's going to have another litigation. It is a mess out there. But we have the science of wetlands. We have the people who kind of said, what's going on out there? We have the economists who talked about how important it is. And what's happening with the value here is we're spending a lot of money on lawsuits. We're spending a lot of energy worrying about this resource. And we're in a space that I'm just not sure how we are going to go forward with this. You know, we've got this term, which is regulated wetlands, but we still don't know quite where they end. And people who want to do things now have to, do I want to just go do it and have them yell at me because I didn't get a permit? There are some core districts that you can do that in. If you're in some really liberal core districts, they're not going to let you do that. They're going to come yell at you, so you're going to go get a permit, but you're going to push the edges to say shouldn't regulate me too hard. And it's really a mess. And we've got lots of these spaces that are now very confusing for people as to what can and can't happen and where there's federal jurisdiction. And people are spending a lot of time and energy trying to figure out what can we do here? What can we do here with this piece of land? What can we do here with something that we're really worried about protecting as a country for the people who tend to be my new clients, because I have access to justice work now, so I represent people who otherwise couldn't afford lawyers with my students. So it's a very, very odd place. I promised ecosystem services. I'm going to just talk quickly about this and why it's important and what underlays some of what happened with the analyses that the scientists did, as well as the analysis that we do when we're mitigating. Wetlands and other waters are unique and productive ecosystems. They are so critical. They play lots of roles in many natural cycles. They purify and replenish water. They provide lots of things like fish and rice. They serve as a natural sponge. They protect against flooding. Part of why Katrina happened is because a lot of wetlands have been taken away in the New Orleans area. They store carbon, becoming increasingly more important in our time of climate change. They regulate quantity, groundwater recharge, and contribute to other things. And they have lots of services that they provide. So if we're thinking about how we're going to value them, We can try and do some of the numbers that Dr. Shelley talked about with respect to doing this, and people do that for some sorts of analyses. But it's really hard to concretize some of this when it comes to wetlands, and so it becomes squishy and becomes a big mess, and then we get into more negotiations and more lawsuits as to they're asking for more mitigation, they're asking for less mitigation, they're having another fight about this. So when we try and actually value it, we know it's valuable. When we try and concretize it, that has yet another drain on the resources of what ecosystems provide to us in the terms of wetlands. And the other thing to add to this is, as regimes change, the wetlands policy changes a little bit or a lot. As courts decide, as courts get change in their makeup, the decisions that happen change a little or a lot. And there's a lot of politics that goes into the valuation of wetlands and water. And yet, the political process itself takes a lot of resources to go through. So a lot of resources that could be gone, that could be going into protecting wetlands, protecting the ecosystem services they provide, or providing other benefits because we don't have to spend on this, and we don't have to have a whole passel of lawyers doing this, even a passel of lawyers doing this in the Department of Justice and in all of the agencies, and they could just do other things. It's really expensive and hard, and we have a lot that we spend to make this happen. But it's really important because we really have a lot of value in the waters and wetlands that we have both here and around. So I guess going back to my question, so legally, how do we value water? It depends, it's hard, and we fight about it a whole lot. So we're going to do questions later, so I will sit down and wait for your questions about the excitement of the Clean Water Act to come.
A lot of perspectives on this and a lot to think about. So our final speaker is going to, I call the boots on the ground perspective. What is it like when you're at the forefront of some of these discussions? That's Lee Wilbanks, Executive Director of Save the River. Save the River, Upper St. Lawrence River Keeper, a not-for-profit, member-based environmental organization with the mission to preserve, protect, and restore the St. Lawrence River, one of North America's most important rivers. Mr. Wilbanks has a law degree from Syracuse University School of Law and a Master's of Public Administration from Syracuse University Maxwell School. His diverse career has spanned from being environmental counsel for an independent power producer to serving as chief of staff to a New York State senator. In 2016, Freshwater Future named Wilbanks a, quote, freshwater hero as the Citizen Advocate of the Year for his, end quote, his persistent and passionate advocacy on complex policy issues. Lee Wilbanks.
Thank you very much, Julia, for a kind and somewhat comprehensive introduction. Thank you for the invitation as well. I told her when we first talked, I was embarrassed to not know anything about the Robert H. Jackson Center. And since that time, I've come to appreciate the center, its mission, the man in honors, and the staff who's been very gracious, particularly Marion, who really, she's the one who dressed me for tonight. So if that's the only thing that we take away from, you've got a great staff here. I wasn't going to say this, but I have to because I've followed two incredible speakers who obviously have a deep understanding of their topic. Many, many, many years ago, when I was sitting in the very first convening of the first-year law students at Syracuse University, and the dean was standing up there and extolling the various virtues and attributes of the incoming class and ticking off what people had done and how tremendous their accomplishments were. I kept going, that's not me. That's not me. And then sort of near the end of the list, he goes, and we've got somebody here from the state of Alabama. And it was like, oh yeah, okay, that's gonna be my job. I'll take the hayseed out and I'll go through and I'll sort of be the bumpkin who's there. So I'm not going to add a lot of depth to your understanding of the value of water. What I hope I can do, though, is bring to you sort of an understanding of what it is like every day to be at a small organization. You touched on it briefly, Julia. Save the River, we're celebrating 40 years this year, which is, I think, a pretty amazing thing for an environmental not-for-profit in upstate New York. We are member-based. We have 1,000 plus or minus members who in any given year pay dues and elect the board and interject themselves into policy decisions. Our mission is pretty simple and has always been preserve, protect, and restore the upper St. Lawrence River now and for generations to come. That mission is premised on a vision of a healthy river that provides safe drinking water, supports a healthy range of indigenous species, and supports sustainable economic activity. In 2004, we became part of the Waterkeeper Alliance, and now with our 300 plus sister organizations worldwide, we work for swimmable, fishable, drinkable water. And I think if you step back and you sort of look at all of those statements, there are different lenses through which people value water. And we do bring to it, we try to bring to it that, and there was some allusion to current events in February of 2017. It caused us to sort of drill even deeper down and make the statement that access to clean water is a fundamental human right. And we stand by all of those things. To achieve that mission, though, Save the River and me as the river keeper, quite frankly, we're aggregators, we're generalists, we're packagers. We take the incredible work of people like Michael and Kim, and we put it into short, pithy bursts where we try to galvanize people who may have very different views about their sense of what the value of water is, sometimes very competing views, but we want to use what we can to get them to achieve discrete and sometimes singular policy or programmatic goals. A great example of that happened today. Somewhat shocking, and I'm a very cynical person. We threw ourselves into the fight with organizations all over the nation, and particularly in the Great Lakes, and the Senate voted down the reauthorization bill for the Coast Guard. And they did that because within that bill was a totally unrelated piece of legislation that would have exempted the ballast water and other discharges from ships from regulation under the Clean Water Act. What we weren't told, because there's so many details to all these pieces, it's hard to follow them, but it wasn't until 2008, quite a time after the adoption of the Clean Water Act, that after court cases, the EPA was forced to begin regulating ships' discharges under the Clean Water Act. So today we fought off a significant regression. The problem is that bill is probably 6-7 years old. It's a Marco Rubio bill that they never could pass as a standalone. So we're going to fight this fight again tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. And I want to say, I think it's important that even though we've been around for 40 years, we've achieved some tremendous policy successes. We've been defeated a few times. Save the River by no means has had or has now a consistent view of what the value of water is. And I don't think we've been consistently correct all the time in what that value is, but we keep fighting it out. And there have been frequent struggles, internal and external. And as I was trying to figure out how to sum those up, I ran across the UN High-Level Panel on Water. And they created some principles, and they have a preamble for their further discussions that they adopted in 2017. And I'm going to paraphrase from the first preamble. Water is more than a substance. It carries multiple values and meanings that are expressed in spiritual, cultural, and emotional terms that reflect deep perceptions, the need for connection and participation of all society. For us, that cultural, emotional package is frequently what we use to achieve these somewhat concrete and frequently argued over values. They went on to say, valuing water can help balance multiple uses and services provided by water. So it's like, okay, we're done. That's great. We've got it all. But you know, it's not choosing to value water. It's choosing the yardstick. It's whose use, whose externalities, what impacts to that downstream user, and on and on and on. And that's where the complexity that you alluded to in terms of what is a wetland. I mean, we begin to lay so much onto it that it's almost a mind-boggling exercise. So my answer to how you value water, it's a moving target. We have no universal answer. It saved the river. But I can tell you that as an advocate standing here in the Robert H. Jackson Center, I'm very comfortable quoting one of his successors. I know it when I see it. And I'm going to use that. So we do have 40 years of experience, and I think I'm going to give you, I can't do the 10,000-year history of the river and the changing values that have been applied to it, but I'm going to cover 70 years by picking one point that occurred well before Save the River came about, and then a related point that we were deeply involved in. But I think it's important, our constituents, the people in our 300,000 plus square mile watershed in both Canada and the US, are predominantly rural, predominantly quite a bit conservative, and almost perpetually lagging behind their province or state or federal national economy. So that's the construct that we're sort of in. So in 1958, when Canada and the US opened the Seaway, the St. Lawrence Seaway, which, by the way, biggest pet peeve I have, referring to my river as a seaway, we're not infrastructure. We're a river. We're a water body. But it happens all the time. So the Seaway was open. It opened the river and the Great Lakes to international shipping. At one point, a newspaper headline in upstate New York and Messina said, Messina will become the Detroit of the North Country. They were just wrong by about 70 years because the comparison is way more apt today than it was then. And the Seaway never fulfilled that economic promise, particularly for New York. The ships largely go through the locks and dam and go somewhere else for their sort of low-value cargo. What we did get to share in New York because of Lake Erie, Lake Ontario, and the St. Lawrence River is the 100-plus invasive species that came in with those ships and were discharged in the river. So we got something out of it. Once the dam and the locks were built, you have to have a mechanism, regime, some kind of protocol to govern the release, the outflows of water. Lake Ontario, this isn't well known, but Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River are the only water bodies in the Great Lakes system that are regulated completely by a dam, the Moses Saunders Dam. So in order to come up with that protocol, it was developed under the aegis of the 1909 Boundary Waters Treaty, which is an incredibly forward-looking treaty in its shared decision-making for the shared waters from Maine to Alaska between the US and Canada. But fortunately, it sort of uses as a valuing of water the lens of 1909 sensibilities. So in Article 8 of the treaty, there's 3 priorities, 3 uses which are supposed to take precedent over all others. There's domestic, and I gotta apologize, they didn't count very well. So there's domestic and sanitary, that's 1. Navigation is 2. And then, strangely enough, power production and irrigation are lumped together as 3. So that's what they did when they constructed the plan that was in place for about 50 plus years, regulating how water would be released, what schedule, what time, and what amounts. In the 80s and 90s, it started to become apparent that that paradigm, that sort of 1909 lens, was causing significant environmental degradation on Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River. It was estimated that 64,000 plus acres of meadow marsh wetland, prime habitat, filtering, all those systems were gone. Black terns had been extirpated from the St. Lawrence River Valley and from much of Lake Ontario. Northern pike and other key aquatic species had declined precipitously. So the science was saying something has to happen. And it became sort of clear what needed to happen, which was a change to the plan. Fortunately, the IJC at about the same time started re-looking at their treaty, and there is, and I need to quote it exactly because I get it wrong sometimes, in the same Article 8, right after it listed the 3, we think 5 uses, says the foregoing provisions shall not apply to or disturb any existing uses. So any uses that existed prior to the enactment of the treaty should take precedent over those 3 that were listed. Well, so for environmentalists, for conservationists, for birders, for anglers, hunters, fishers, wreck boaters, that was like, we can work with this. And flash forward to 1999, 2 Congress people from New York, a Republican and a Democrat, were able to get $10 million appropriated for the beginning of a study of how to solve this problem. 15 years later, after roughly a decade of ridiculous amounts of public participation and consultation, which even as an advocate, I got tired of going and testifying about, we got a new plan. In January of 2017, just last year, Plan 2014. Again, they're not good with counting, they're not good with names. So Plan 2014, enacted in 2017, was rightly characterized at the time it was adopted as the 2nd largest wetland restoration project in North America, second only to the Everglades. And the cost was telling the guys who operated the dam to do it a little differently. I mean, there were lots of tables and studies and exhaustive valuing of the services of the wetlands, wreck boating, everything else. But it really came down to, we're just going to slightly change the way water flows through the dam. Now, what they did was they wanted to restore more of the natural ups and downs over the year that the water flow had for 9,950 years before they built the dam, and to allow slightly higher highs and slightly lower lows based on what was happening in nature. I mean, it sort of blows your mind that that's a concept that we had to create then. But almost immediately, good science, good intentions, 20 years of hard work ran headlong into the most negative of coincidences. Because the spring of 2017 saw unprecedented rainfall throughout the Great Lakes Basin, 200 to 400% of the typical rainfall for that time of year, that led Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River to set new historic highs in May, June, and July. And so for a lot of people, riparians, the politicians who represent them, and others, it was too much, too soon for them to accept. And good science and good public policy be damned. Something had to go change and go back. Now, the funny thing is, we know that the lake and the river have roughly a 20 to 30-year cycle of flooding and drought. But that isn't what we wanted to look at. And I think, sort of to sum it all up, I think for all of us, particularly for those who felt like the plan, incorrectly felt like the plan hurt them, there's language in the very first preamble of that UN document that says, water is precious, it's fragile, and it's dangerous. And that's the lens we're now going to have to work within. Thanks.
So, exhale on that. I know that we're running very late. And so I invite the panelists to come up. I had some prepared questions, but I know this is a very educated audience, and I can imagine that what's been discussed might bring to your thoughts some questions. And so maybe for just a short while, if anybody has any questions, we can discuss those, and then we will be letting you out of here because I know it's late.
Michael mentioned something. I forget what it was that set me off, but it was about valuing water. And I think it's fairly reprehensible. We can sort of do away with the fact that taking water and putting it in bottles, plastic bottles, is silly in itself. And there was it was a small sample, but there was just a sample. Probably when you drink out of that bottled water, you're ingesting plastic. So, we're becoming plastic people because of everything that's being put in. But I think for us, when you look at a company like Nestle's that's allowed to draw such tremendous amounts of water, even though in the scheme of the Great Lakes it's small, at a very nominal price, and yet in Flint, Michigan, in the last 2 years, since 2016, there's been 45,000 shutoffs because people can't pay $200 a month for water. There's something wrong in that equation, and I don't think we're treating water like the human necessity that it is, and we shouldn't allow it.
There are myriad issues with respect to bottled water, not the least of which is environmental justice or environmental injustice. And I, many years ago, stopped drinking bottled water unless an absolute necessity, because it's just not fair, and because we spend enormous amounts of money to make sure that as an entity, to make sure that the water that comes out is clean. And so we should be doing that, and then there's lots of other things to rethink, but you bring up a really important and good point.
Also, one of the problems with bottled water isn't just the use of the water, it's the residue, it's the bottles themselves. Right. From the economics point of view is that the price of the water, the product isn't fully priced in the sense that you're not pricing in the cost of the disposal or the environmental damage done by the container. We're a little more advanced here than they are in some countries. I just read this week that in Britain they're just about to bring in a deposit return law like we have here. Just about to. People have just been tossing their water bottles, out the window as they go along. So it's bad here. It also depends where you are. If you go to the developing countries, they really don't have a source of safe drinking water in many places, so they do rely on bottled water. But there's better ways to supply clean water than putting it in bottles and selling it, for a couple of dollars. Okay. With they have, because I'm not a biologist, but I just listened to a talk about these from a biologist, so I'll pass that on. They're very good filter feeders. They can process a tremendous amount of water in a short period of time. The problem with they impose costs though. One of the things is they get so abundant that they get on water intakes, they get on structures. That's one problem. The other problem is that they're eating the nutrients that the other creatures would eat. So they do clean up the lake, but they reduce the food available to other creatures. And then by clearing up the lake, by allowing more sunshine in, they make the algae problem worse. So those are some of the things that are problems with them. Yeah, and yeah. there must be
So
more.
clarifying the water isn't necessarily making the water healthier, is I guess the summary of that, which is having water that you can see down lower doesn't necessarily mean that you've got healthy water. And we've got somebody who works on this every day sitting right there, but I just wanted to add that. Yeah.
Well, I do think, I mean, sure, we like to see our toes when we're walking. We like to be able to see the bass on the bed so we can pick them off. But it's the clarity. You're removing nutrients that the smallest, food fish would normally eat, or the other organisms. And so I think what you're seeing is that we're thinning out the populations of a lot of fish because the energy is going into the mussels and coming out in their poop, and we're not getting it in the water column. The other, there's some other unattractive problems with them. On the eastern shore of Lake Ontario, there's botulism is, a type of botulism is endemic in the sediments. And the mussels have ingested that and circulated it, and I'm not gonna be completely good on the connection here, but it winds up that certain birds, like loons, wind up ingesting the botulism that they wouldn't have otherwise if it hadn't been resuspended. It doesn't kill them, but it in effect makes them drunk. They can't hold their heads up, and we frequently have big die-offs of birds. They drown. They can't breathe. So the problem with invasives, and particularly a system as immense as the Great Lakes, of the 100+ that were introduced after the Seaway, they're not all concentrated in one place, and they're not all spread uniformly throughout. So like on the St. Lawrence River, you have a system that now is so perturbed between round goby, mussels, viral hemorrhagic septicemia, which almost wiped out the muskellunge population, that this system, the biologists don't know where it's going to settle out. And so we don't know what the end point is of all these species, but we do know that what was there before we introduce them probably won't come back, and we will lose aspects of the river we consider healthy.
Are they edible?
I don't.
Anyone eating them?
I think there's too much toxic though.
They're also small. You'd have to
Very
work
tiny.
really hard. You need a really big plate of them. But I don't think anybody does
Also,
eat.
another cost of them is that you have to clarify the water that we drink, because in Buffalo, do you remember a few years ago, it used to taste of their poo, and now they have to clarify it to. It's been
The DC just undertook, actually, where I'm from. They did a huge tunnel.
Yeah.
Because that's an infrastructure issue for a lot of cities, the combined storm and sewer. And so they're tackling it. If I could, I'll just say from my experience that they're tackling DC as a very, very innovative DC Water, which their slogan is "Water is life," and to not have to do these massive tunnels, they've been using green roofs and bioretention and bringing in a whole slew of other methods to absorb and buffer the waters before it gets, so that you don't have that combined. But they did do a ginormous tunnel, so DC's maybe leading the way in this in some regards, but I'll let.
Right, and there have been, and I'm going to do both of your questions, but I'm going to start with this one, which is I think that there have combined sewer. They've just been a mess everywhere, and figuring them out is hard, and figuring them out is place-specific, because water systems are run by localities. And so Buffalo can't necessarily do what DC has done, and then there's interest groups that may say, well, we should be doing these constructed wetlands, or we should be doing these other things, and then people get into internecine warfare, and then 6 months goes by. But it's a huge problem, and part of it also is there's just not the resources that were first envisioned when I was talking about 1972, like we're going to be doing all this. There's just not the resources to undertake and to come up with the amount of money it takes to really bring things into current operations is something that takes a lot. I love your question. I love your question about Canada and the U.S. When the very first year that we started working on the bilateral work to designate the Niagara River corridor, my students had to go out and be seeing, okay, what do we need to do on the U.S. side and what do we need to do on the Canadian side, and learning about the federal law and then the provincial and the state law, and then figuring out what was going on in the localities, and it was mind-blowing. And at that point, it was thinking that it was going to be harder, and you're right, there's been a switch in politics, but then there's been a switch in politics on a federal level, but then there's been a different switch in politics on a local level, so provincially it's gotten harder in Canada at times. So when you're trying to do bilateral things, it has so much potential, but the intricacies of navigating it is why it's taken us. We're in the 5th year of trying to get this water body designated. We've had the science done since year 1. It's been the politics and the law and working this stuff through that has taken us to this year 5, where we're getting so close and are hoping that we'll be able to announce at the next World Wetlands Day that the Niagara River has been sent in for designation.
On the combined sewer thing, in Buffalo, they are, well, as you know, the EPA is forcing them to address the problem, and so there's a number of ways you can do it. There's a sort of the hardware system, which is upgrade the water system, and they're doing that. They've got infrastructure there that's built for a much larger city. It was built at they put in the sewers in the 30s when they thought the city was going to grow much faster than it actually did, and it's actually gone down. So they're converting some of those sewers into storage tanks, basically, because the problem is it's a stock and flow thing. The wastewater treatment plant can treat a certain amount in an hour, and if you get too much coming through, it bypasses. It goes over weirs and it bypasses. So what you want to do is cut down that peak flow. So one way to do it is to store it and just release it more slowly. And then another way is to stop it getting into the system, and that's the green infrastructure. So sometimes you'll see roads where they have like a green bit on the side, and that's basically a soak away. Or they're doing it in Buffalo, give people rain barrels. And then another part of it is to try and, you've got illegal hookups where people have got, the drainage from their backyard is going into the sewer, so you can try and stop that as well. But it's very costly, it takes a lot of time, but they're by law, they've got to do it, and they're doing the same in Syracuse, I believe. So.
No, nothing on the bilateral, okay? Yes.
We had a gentleman who, for several years, screamed at us because of what he called the trillions of gallons of fracking wastewater that was being dumped in New York State. And so we partnered with the Hudson Riverkeeper and others who had a little bit larger capacity, did Freedom of Information Act. And I can tell you that very near us, a wastewater treatment plant in Watertown, New York, took 2 loads of fracked waste several years ago as part of a controlled study to see what would come out of the end of the pipe. Since that time, we don't know of any sustained systemic dumping. It would be subject to regulatory approval, because what does come out of the end of a publicly owned treatment works is a highly regulated, if still somewhat unpleasant, brew of stuff. And what it appears will survive from fracking waste through a treatment process is not acceptable for water in New York State. So we've been monitoring it. Yeah, I'd never say absolute, nothing's absolute, because the minute you say we know it isn't happening, somebody does it either illegally or not. But it doesn't seem to be a problem in New York.
With fracking, it's another thing that they're not really paying the true costs of production, because it's a consumptive use of water, in the sense that once you've used it, you can't really return it back to nature because it's contaminated. So various schemes, there have been schemes where they were going to pump it back up and then reuse it at different sites, and of course the resistance to that is it costs, from the production side, is it costs them more money. And then they were talking about injecting it in underground.
Ohio's experience.
Yeah, and then you get earthquakes and yeah, so it's an unsolved problem, because they do have to use this water, they do contaminate it, and then what do they do with it? Well, I know that for things like nutrients, they work out, do studies and they try and figure out where the sources are coming from. And it's hard to do when it's a diffuse source, like a field. It's easier to do when it's a sewage treatment plant, because you can just, as you say, you can just take the water and you can analyze it. So it's much harder to do. And so what they do some studies. They can never be completely sure. It's also harder to deal with because you're dealing with more people. If it's just a sewer treatment plant, that's just one entity you have to deal with. If it's farming, then you've got all the different farmers, and who knows who's contributing what. So that gets to be hard. So some of the ways they try to regulate, they try and do that is through modelling, but they also sometimes put a tax on inputs, like on fertilizer and such like, and try and do it that way. But it's tough. You were saying about non-point
Stakeholder,
sources.
yeah, I often have a slide that I show when I'm talking about working with waters that is a picture of people playing swamp soccer, because we're all fighting. And the thing is, as you've pointed out, we know the players. However, people get lumped into groups that I think may not share all the same values, and we can't have productive discussions because of the nature of things. I actually am going to go totally off topic here. I actually am really starting to work a lot, and I'm working toward my certification in restorative practices, because I'd like to see, which has typically been used in one-on-one types of situations where there's been crimes and victims and things like that. I'd like to see more functional things where they originally tried to do regulatory negotiations back in the 80s, and there was some success, but there wasn't enough, and it's been mostly abandoned and it's become more political. I'd really love to see a new way of thinking about opening up a circle of discussion where people were able to really be able to be present and stop and listen and hear, so that we could all have a sense of things together and then collectively work, rather than starting with the sides. Part of what's challenging about the system that I work in is that I said lawsuits, and we have an adversarial system. And oftentimes the people who can spend lots of money, I mean, back when I was in private practice, people spent lots of money for me to pull all-nighters to write briefs. That's what they did. And then on the other side, we had my friend Ed Lloyd, who now teaches at Columbia, but at that point was at Rutgers. He was on the other side with his students, so then they'd pull an all-nighter. Unpaid, they were paying for the course, but they'd pull an all-nighter in the clinic, and the fights would happen, but they'd be so sided, and there's not these kind of conversations. I think you're picking up on something really good and really important that I'm really starting to think more deeply about as we're moving forward into this.
So two examples of issues we're very deeply involved in. Well, one was the new water levels plan, which I think the IJC, the International Joint Commission, which is the body created by the treaty, for these two water bodies, they did exhaustive public consultations. They did hearings all around the basin. In 2013 or 14, I think they did 12, 6 in both countries. And unfortunately, it frequently came down to who talked the longest and the loudest. I think they were in a unique position, being binational, sort of apart from and immune to the lawsuits. They could take all those comments, be as respectful as they could of all of us, because I will, admit, even on the side that won, we frequently were sometimes quite upset and frustrated at how long they were taking, because it was so clear what the answer was. And they were able to make a decision based on the science, and now, God bless us, we all have to live with it, and that's okay. But then there's the issue of Asian carp that was alluded to, that will head into Lake Michigan through the Chicago area waterway system. And we're not at the table, but a table's been created that includes environmentalists, conservationists, anglers, and the American Waterways Association, shippers, tugboat owners, and others. And they've engaged in a multi-year process that branched off of the Glimmerous study. And very frankly, there are some people at the table who are using that process of collaboration to draw it out. And I think they're very close to deadlocking it so that progress won't be made. And we'll go back to doing what we do, which is, I'm frequently in Washington with other groups, with other people, and you try to, behind you, you have this image of the phalanx of hundreds of thousands, millions of constituents who need this, want this. God bless you if you make it work. We need it first. We'll pay for you to come and do it. Because we're at a point where we slice every issue so thinly and look at it so myopically and so zero-sum game-ish that it's very, it took 20 years to get a new water levels plan. If I start another process that takes 20 years, it'll kill me. I just don't know how people do it, but they're entrenched interests that fight very hard. And frequently, it's because I do think government has a role that we're abdicating of demanding that externalities be taken into account. And if, of course, the other thing is, and I'll admit it as a partisan, we frequently abandon our sense of what other people need or want. It's easy to talk about a natural rhythm and flow to a water body with slightly higher highs and lower lows, but it's not my ancestral cottage that probably shouldn't have been built where it was, but it has been, and it's been there 100 years, and it's lost. And so that person isn't really going to care what I say, but I need to try to care about what they're feeling and draw them into the discussion. And quite frankly, some days it's just a pain in the ass to do that. And it's very hard. And I think, I don't think there's an easy answer. And some of these problems, we've taken care of the big problems. This is the other thing, that I have a beautiful river. It hasn't burned. If it burned, I could galvanize the community to immediate action. But as we are now doing the finer grain stuff, and we're trying to solve these more global problems, we just have more people at the table, and we have more perspectives, and they're set up so that they're competing. And I think that may be a long-term problem for solving these things.
Wow. It's at 9 o'clock now, and I think we could go on all night. Okay, how about one more?
Okay. I'm just curious as to what your thoughts would be on the likelihood, the chance of water, say in 50, 70 years, as congressional representation moves to where the population is going, water being diverted from Great Lakes, Northeast, to other areas of the country.
There'll certainly be pressure to do that. There already has been. And I don't know what the legal situation is, but I think you can't do it at the moment. But there will be pressure to do it, because it'll, from an economics point of view, the water will be more valuable for them because they don't have enough, and they'll pay more for it. But you saw the consumption that we're having of the water, the amount of water that we withdraw from the system we don't put back in is quite small at the moment. So we could probably withdraw some, but then what sort of biological impacts it would have, I don't know. It would depend how much you did it.
That is a really good question, and we need to think about that a lot. There are some barriers to it, but we've seen this. Pardon me? Right, but we've seen just in the past couple years of this administration that traditional barriers for making decisions can be dismantled, and so I can imagine a world in which the fights will have to be more vigorous, and we'll have to find ways of investing and stopping the type of migration away from this amazing space that we have in the Great Lakes. I can imagine it. But it's a possibility. Yes, but things would have to be legal changes. But it's not. I can imagine. If I were on the other side, I can imagine ways that I would be starting to think about doing this, and
Well,
keeps me up at night.
I think if you imagine Atlanta going through a drought, a sustained Cape Town kind of loss of water. There's a maxim that I keep in my head all the time, usually for small problems, which is we're all environmentalists until it somehow affects us in a way that makes us do things we don't want to do. And then suddenly, I mean, we had somebody come in our office, they were all upset. Somebody was building a distillery, which really had no discharges, right up from them on a stream, and they wanted us to fight it. And without walking out of the office and coming back in, they then started complaining about the Army Corps of Engineers not issuing them a permit for their property in Georgia to fill a wetland. So, I mean, the lens through which we look at any particular issue is affected a lot of times by how it affects us. But if the nation is faced with a major metropolitan area running out of water, absolutely, you're going to see the second or first most amazing engineering project in the world, because it would be immensely expensive to move that kind of water from the Great Lakes. It's not, it's not like,
Might be cheaper to move the people to the water.
yeah. But,
That's what people in this area would like to happen, is people to come back to the water.
Yeah.
They also don't want the snow.
Stored water.
Climate change is going to take care of that.
Such vibrant discussion to this evening's program, and of course to thank the panel for starting us. Certainly Lee, Kim, Michael, and of course Julia for allowing us to think on a macro level. Hopefully everyone will go home and think about these issues in a more deep and informed way. This is, of course, part of the Green Up Jamestown initiative. Please put April 21st on your calendar at St. Luke's Church. There will be an Earth Day festival there as well. And of course, keep the Jackson Center in mind. We're so glad you're here tonight to be part of our world where we think about these issues every day from both sides of the aisle. So thank you for being part of that conversation, and travel safely.